personal other favorite episodes of Seinfeld is definitely the Hamptons. And as I've been saying for the longest time, I couldn't wait to talk about this episode because mostly because of the behind the scenes story behind how this episode came together. And I just find it just priceless how Peter Melman told the story as to how these came together, and just how, like, enthusiastic, like, Larry David was. Like, this is one of the few times where Larry David was just like, use it a lot, emphasize it a ton. I don't care how much you may say, just use it a lot, overdo it if you have to or whatnot. So the first idea that he had about the Hamptons, well, the main story about the Hamptons is everyone goes out to like a summer house out in the Hamptons for the weekend to visit their friends Michael and Carol, because they had another baby. You gotta see the baby. You gotta see the baby. As they were the same people who Jerry and Kramer went to see the baby in the Boyfriend episode, whenever Keith Hernandez canceled Jerry's plans with him, and Jerry and Kramer went to go see the baby instead that night. But they're traveling up, and it was going to be Jerry, Elaine, Kramer, and Rachel Goldstein, of course, who was Jerry's girlfriend in the Raincoats episodes. Apparently, I guess Jerry brought him some type of dish or whatnot that basically, he was able to make up for, give him a better impression after the whole Schindler's List incident in the Raincoats. So Rachel's going to be joining them later, but I don't remember why, but she was going to be catching a 3 o'clock train to come out to the Hamptons for the weekend and join them later. But of course, they're talking about how George is bringing his girlfriend Jane along. This will be the first time, though, that they've slept together, though. They had not had like a physical relationship yet so far. I don't know how long it was been since they were dating. This is the first time we've seen her, of course. So they're hyping that all that up. They get to the Hamptons, and they were relaxing out on the porch. And then George, though, decides he wants to go stop at one of the supermarkets to get some Hampton tomatoes. Apparently his mom is a huge fan of the Hampton tomatoes. So as soon as he walks away, Jane, who didn't want to go for the ride, gets up and says she's going to go take a dip out in the lake. So she heads over there. And then all of a sudden, after just chatting for a minute or so, they look over, and Jane is walking around the beach topless. This idea, of course, was the first idea for Peter Melman for this episode, as he had something happen like 10 years earlier when his friend's fiance went walking around a summer house topless. And of course, he's thinking like, oh man, so my friend's literally been working for this for years, and now we're all getting it for free, basically. So as soon as George leaves, his girlfriend, who he has not yet, gotten physical yet or slept with yet, is basically showing everyone else what he should be seeing first. So obviously, Jerry, when she comes back over, asks if anybody wants a drink. They were just like awkward, like no thanks. So she walks in. And then Kramer gets up and he heads out to the beach to hang out on the beach for a little bit. And then Michael and Carol tell Jerry and Elaine to come in because the baby's ready to see them. So they head in, and this baby is apparently super ugly. We cannot see the baby, but it was ugly. But Jerry and Elaine didn't want to say anything. Jerry would then leave to head out to the train station to pick up Rachel, while Elaine stuck around. But then, of course, she became, smitten by the baby, whose name was Adam, the baby's pediatrician. And basically he told Elaine that she's quite breathtaking, which Elaine was quite flattered by that because she, obviously was attracted to this doctor. And she says how she would love to have a baby someday. I was trying to impress the doctor, because I don't think Elaine ever would want to have kids. I never could see Elaine, being a mother, no offense, with how petty she can be at times. But then, of course, she gets, startled whenever the doctor also says that the ugly baby is breathtaking as well. So that makes Elaine wonder, geez, how could you call me breathtaking to call the ugly baby breathtaking? Like what are you, what's actually true here? Like, are you being nicer to one of us or what? What's going on here? So meanwhile, Kramer goes out onto the beach, and he was hanging out. He was sitting up on a lifeguard deck until the cops ran him off, and then he went down the beach and he finds this rope. He pulls it up, and it's a lobster trap, and there was lobsters in there. So he decides to take them back to the summer house to share them with the rest of the gang. Meanwhile, Jerry gets back from the train station with Rachel, talking about her ride out, and of course, Jerry though and Elaine had also agreed to not they're not saying anything to George about seeing Jane topless. The only problem is they didn't get to tell Kramer not to say anything to George, because George gets back too, and at first things seem a little like tiffy whenever he sees Rachel. She didn't really seem like she was much of a fan of him, so I don't know if George was going to obsess over her liking her next, because remember in the masseuse episode where George obsessed over the fact that Jerry's girlfriend Jody didn't like him. But I don't think it got super duper that far yet. Of course, George was more interested in seeing something else. We'll get into that in a second, which is why I love this episode. Not because I did mention the Raincoats Part 2, that I think Rachel was one of Jerry's hottest girlfriends for sure, but just the backstory and how I always take this as like an inside joke wherever I go. But anyways, so George gets back, and then Kramer runs back up to the summer house celebrating that he got the lobsters. Everybody's like, "Oh, that's awesome, that's great." So as he's going on about that, he just happened just to spurt out and look over George and goes, "Hey, I saw Jane topless," and then Jerry's like, "Oh gosh." So George is freaking out. Jerry's basically saying like "Oh, it was good. I could see her naked or whatnot, or whatnot." And George getting more upset about that whenever Jerry kept jagging him about it. And then all this stuff. So obviously George feels very upset the fact that again that everybody else got to see his girlfriend topless first before he did. So of course Jerry was like, "What would make you feel better? Would it make you feel better if you saw Rachel naked?" And George was like, "Yes, that's it." Which Jerry even thought that was an insane idea. So then later on, they're in George sees Elaine in the hall. She just came out of Jerry's bedroom, and she said, "Don't come in there. Rachel's getting changed." And he's like, "Okay." So Elaine starts to walk away. George starts to follow because Elaine wants to try to figure out about what that doctor meant about saying both her and the ugly baby were breathtaking. But George turns around and is like, "Nope, I want to go pop in by mistake," and opens up the door, and Rachel I think was starting to take her pants off, but she pulled it up, and she was already seemed annoyed with George the way it was, and then of course she's like, "What you doing in here?" And then of course Jerry playing dumb because he obviously knows what George is up to. So then finally he covers up and says that he was just seeing if he wanted some gum. He just happened to go swimming in the pool. So then of course he just says, "I'll leave you to be," and walks away to go get changed out of his swimming suit from swimming in the pool. So then here comes my favorite part. Well, what leads to my favorite story in this episode. Now here's where of course I love the way Peter Melman told this backstory. Again, the first idea was the idea about George's girlfriend walking around topless, and basically everybody else gets to see George has been trying to get to that for a while now, but everybody else gets it for free. George, meanwhile, had to work his way up the ladder for it. But there came to a point where Melman was really struggling to find some more stories for that episode. And then one day, Larry David pitches this idea, and here's what it was. So after George walked away to go, get changed out of his swimming stuff, Rachel asks about where the baby is, and of course Jerry's like, and the funny thing is Jerry was like, "Oh, you won't believe it," hyping up how ugly the baby is. Meanwhile, it led to a mishap. He tells her it's down the hall, third door on the left. So Rachel goes down the hall and opens up George's room as George was getting changed. So George wanted to, get, his retaliation for everybody else seeing Jane topless by seeing Rachel, Jerry's own girlfriend, naked. Instead, it backfires because Rachel opens up George's door and she sees George getting changed. And she freaks out and she goes, "Oh my goodness, I'm sorry, I thought this was the baby's room." And she chuckled because she was like, "I'm really sorry," and walks away. But then George looks down, looks back up, and he starts freaking out. He's like, "I was in the pool! I was in the pool!" And at first, if you're, not familiar with, certain reproductive system stuff or whatnot, you don't know what the heck he's talking about at first. Cut to the next scene. Jerry's talking to George in a separate room. Jerry's apologized, he goes, "It's my fault, I told her the wrong room, this, that," but he's like, "It's no big deal, like, what's the big problem about the fact that she saw you naked?" George goes, "Well, ordinarily I wouldn't mind, but," and Jerry's like, "But what?" George goes, "Well, see, I just got back from swimming in the pool, and the water was cold," implying something. And then Jerry goes, "Oh, so you mean shrinkage?" And then George is like, "Yes, significant shrinkage. If she thinks that's," and basically Jerry's like, "Oh, so you felt you were shortchanged?" Like, "Yes, very shortchanged. Because if she thinks that's me, that is not me at all whatsoever." Basically saying George has a small one when he really doesn't. And then George is freaking out because he's like, it's like, what if Rachel discusses it with Jane? And then Jerry's like, "I don't think women know about shrinkage and whatnot." And they go, "But he says he thinks they do. Women discuss everything." So they're trying to figure out some way to make George feel better. So Elaine walks past the room at the same time, and they're like, Elaine, and just like gets her to come in. And they ask her, "Elaine, do women know about shrinkage?" And Elaine's like, "Oh, what do you mean, like laundry?" And like, "No, like when a man goes swimming afterwards." And Elaine, the light bulb goes over her head. She's like, "Oh, wait, it shrinks?" Like a frightened turtle. And then Elaine just says, "Why does it shrink?" And every time my dad and I watch this episode together, or when we just for the heck of it just quote it for the heck of it, we both just always emphasize how George goes, "It just does." And Elaine was like, "I don't know how you guys walk around with those things." She just walks away like, whatever. But basically, again, Melman was struggling with the episode. But then Larry David comes up to him one day and says, "Hey, I got an idea for your episode. What if George goes swimming in the pool and the water's cold and Jerry's girlfriend accidentally walks on him getting changed?" And Melvin's like, "Oh, so you mean like shrinkage?" And then Larry was like, "Yes, shrinkage. Use it a lot. Overdo it. I don't care how many times you say it. Just use that word a lot. Just oversaturate shrinkage in there all you want, basically." And of course they did, because then in the next scene we had everyone eating the lobster. And of course, first, Michael was asking Kramer where he found the lobsters from, the supermarket, and then he mentions no, he found it, out on the lake. He found a rope pulled up. There was a bunch of lobsters, and then but Michael corrected him. He goes, "Those are commercial lobster traps. You can't be taking those." And then I forgot, he went on a rant about something, wherever it was. The baby started crying, so everybody's like, "No, don't go get the baby," because obviously they knew how ugly the baby was, but they didn't want to be rude and say something to Michael and Carol. But she still goes and gets the baby anyways. So while it's going on, George, just out of panic, says, "Oh, Rachel, my shirt, it shrunk while it was in the wash, because that's what cold water does. It shrinks things." And Rachel just chuckles, leans over, and whispers something to Jane, who's next to her. And George just starts freaking out of like what he possibly could have told her, which he knows basically told him that George has a small it down there, if you know what I mean. So then, of course, they bring the baby out, and then Kramer just turns around, sees him, and just like freaks out by how ugly it is. And then Elaine goes on the porch later that night, and she's chilling with the doctor, and she basically tries to slowly ease her way into the conversation about the baby. And the doctor says something like, and of course Elaine mentions how like she couldn't help to say an ugly baby is breathtaking, and so is she also. And then the doctor goes, well, Elaine, sometimes you just say things just to be nice, and Elaine's just like very turned off by that. Meanwhile, Jerry and Rachel were in their room, and Rachel told Jerry she told Jane what happened, how she walked in on George and that. And then Jane was in the other room. Everybody was like, I'm sure it was no big deal, but in the other room, Jane was packing up, saying she was going to head back to New York, and just at that moment she had to get back. But I think George thinks again she was turned off by what Rachel told Jane. He goes, you don't understand, there was shrinkage. And then later that night, Kramer was sitting in the kitchen, and Rachel came into the kitchen. Now, I forgot to mention this before, but Rachel's family's kosher, so she doesn't eat lobster. So then she kind of had the urge to try the lobster. But Kramer, who thought it was, unique that she stuck to her rituals, was trying to talk her out of it. Of course, Rachel goes back to bed, and when she walks in there, she goes, I heard a car drive away. What was that? And then Jerry goes, oh, it was Jane driving back to New York in the middle of the night, and which Rachel looked shocked. So obviously she probably felt, a little, bit responsible for it and seemed to care a little bit. Of course, though, George had his own plan of revenge. Because the following morning, he made breakfast. He made everybody eggs. And, everybody eats them. Rachel was the last one in. She sits down and starts eating the eggs. And then George walks over and goes, oh yeah, by the way, Rachel, I think you might want to wear this while eating them. And it was a bib that had a lobster on it. Rachel drops her fork. She's like, there's lobster in these eggs? And then George goes, well, they tend to shrink a little, and then just pisses off Rachel, gets up and storms out of the room. So Jerry follows her, trying to calm her down, and then George's like, you know what, I better go apologize. So he walks away, and as he's walking away, though, a police officer knocks on the door, and Michael answers the door, and he basically says that, they're trying to track down someone who has taken one of the lobster traps, and he flat out just pointed at Kramer and said, there he is. And Kramer at first was like, yeah, hi, how you doing? Meantime, he was getting in trouble. And then George heads to go to apologize, but of course, which I don't get why, because, I thought she was already changed and ready for the day. But apparently he walked in on Rachel naked again. But again, I didn't get that because I thought Rachel already seemed like she was changed into, like her regular clothes and not pajamas or whatnot. And of course Rachel, screamed and got pissed off. So then everybody was driving back to New York, which Rachel rode separately with Michael and Carol, and Jerry and Elaine drove George. Kramer, meanwhile, was having to do community service, like cleaning up trash along the highway to make up for taking that commercial lobster trap. So they thought, oh, we would stop at and get some more Hamptons tomatoes, and then they say, oh, look, there's Michael and Carol's car, and they say, oh, there's Rachel, and George picks out the window and is like, where? And Rachel throws a tomato and hits George right in the face, and that's how the episode ends. I love this episode, especially the whole shrinkage story. And then the part where they're trying to get Elaine's attention, she goes, Elaine! Every time I go to my grandparents' apartment, they live right down the hall from where my mom's cousin Elaine lives. And every time I walk past the hall, I go, Elaine! Of course, she's never heard me once to this day, but just a funny little inside joke. This episode originally was actually going to be called The Ugly Baby. But I'm glad that they went with the Hamptons instead. Of course, I also thought the previous episode, the Raincoats, should have been called the Close Talker, but that's not the case. But just that, and again, this the fact that I love this episode solely because I love Peter Melman's backstory about how like he was really struggling, and then Larry David suggests the whole shrinkage story and how he's like, yes, shrinkage, use it a lot, use that word a lot. Like from that moment when I saw that inside look, I'm instantly a fan of Peter Melman. So I loved it, and I love the Hamptons episode. Again, it's definitely one of my personal favorites. But we have one more episode left in this in season 5 as we get to the opposite in the next episode. It's a very well known episode for sure, and to me, and a lot of people, it's probably the best George Costanza episode. Well, why is that? We'll talk about it next. All I can say, guys, if every instinct you have is wrong, then the opposite would have to be right. What does that all mean? We'll talk about that next. So, guys, once again, what were your thoughts on the Hamptons episode? Leave your thoughts down in the comments section below. Be sure as always to slap a like on the video, subscribe for more content to my channel, and follow me on Twitter at DemandAirBarney3. And also, once again, guys, why does it shrink? It just does. And women do not understand how you walk around with those things. I will see you guys later in the opposite review. Have a great rest of your night, guys, and peace out, everybody.